This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by N+1 magazine, which publishes some of the most urgent political writing, essays, and cultural criticism on the left today. One new piece that might be of interest to Dig listeners is William Harris's Acid Rhythms, out now in the magazine's latest issue. Harris, who has written for N+1 on everything from anti-colonial cinema to basketball, follows the evolution of Detroit's music scene in the 1960s and 70s. Surveying the rise and fall of a multiracial movement in Detroit's streets, nightclubs, and auto factories, Harris argues that the city's diverse musical cultures and countercultures not only reflected the street-level politics of deindustrialization, but expressed the era's most revolutionary possibilities, too. Dig listeners can take 25% off a subscription to N+1 at n+1mag.com/thedig. Enter The Dig, one word, at checkout to get 3 issues delivered in the mail, plus access to 20 years of paywalled writing for less than $3 a month. That's n+1mag.com/thedig. Enter The Dig, one word, at checkout. Welcome to The Dig, a podcast from Jacobin Magazine. My name is Daniel Denver, and I'm broadcasting from Providence, Rhode Island. This is the 16th and final episode of Thawra, the Dig's series on 20th century Arab politics with historian Abdel Razzaq Takriti. Thawra is Arabic for revolution. It's a word that contains historical multitudes, diverse political radicalisms and revolts that have swept across Arab lands over the past century. This is the last episode of the series, though we will be recording a substantial epilogue. We're concluding Thawra in 1982, when Israel invaded Lebanon and then laid siege to Beirut. It was a brutal assault on the Lebanese and Palestinian people that forced the PLO to evacuate the city that had become not only its primary base of operation, but the headquarters for a regional revolution against American imperialism, Zionism, and Arab reaction. This episode marks the end of the entire period of Arab politics that we've spent dozens of hours analyzing. A 3-decade wave of anti-imperialist struggle kicked off by the Egyptian Free Officers coup in 1952, which itself drew on rich traditions of struggle from the twilight of the Ottoman Empire through the years of European colonial domination of the Mashriq imposed after World War I. We finished the last episode discussing U.S. policy under Presidents Nixon and Ford, Henry Kissinger's effort to disunify Arab states, realign them against the Soviet Union, and isolate the Palestinians and their national question. This episode, we pick up where we left off. As the balance of power shifted against the PLO, Yasser Arafat and Fatah led the Palestinian movement toward a diplomatic offensive that would accept, at least as an interim settlement, the formation of a sovereign independent state in just Gaza, East Jerusalem, and the West Bank. It would be a state at last, but only on 22% of historic Palestine. As one might expect, this change in program was not uncontroversial, and it sparked dissent from the Palestinian left, led by the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, as well as the leftist wing of Fatah, who rejected anything that might sacrifice the PLO's goal of establishing a democratic and non-denominational state across the entirety of historic Palestine. But Arafat and his allies were motivated by the fear that Palestinians risked losing absolutely everything. Ultimately, the PLO leadership's implicit willingness to concede a staggering 78% of historic Palestine in exchange for a state didn't matter. Despite the compromises of Palestinian leadership, the balance of forces that would have made such an offer tempting to Tel Aviv had been upended. In 1978, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat drove the final nail into Nasser's revolutionary coffin and took the U.S. up on its offer to recognize Israel at Camp David in exchange for the return of the Sinai. Under Sadat, Egypt no longer posed a threat to Israel, which meant that Israel was no longer vulnerable to a war led by Arab nations that might challenge the settler state's borders, let alone put an end to that state altogether. The upshot was that the Palestinian Revolution increasingly stood alone. In 1982, Israel, under far-right Likud president Menachem Begin, launched its second invasion of Lebanon. The first of these, launched in 1978, had attempted to push the PLO back from the border. Israel only withdrew after handing the occupation of the border region to a Lebanese proxy army they had created. The 1982 invasion sought to completely destroy the PLO as a force in Lebanon, with the Zionist military and allied right-wing Maronite Phalangist militias battling the PLO and its allies on the Lebanese left, namely the Lebanese National Movement. Syria, after having turned on the PLO and the Lebanese left in 1976, switched sides again to fight the Israelis. But the Arab states, with lofty pan-Arab ambitions now overwhelmingly neutralized, largely stood by as the Israeli onslaught caused widespread death and destruction, culminating in a murderous siege of Beirut. It was the most horrific Israeli attack against civilians until the onset of the present genocide in Gaza. The Arab world that had been led by Nasser would have fought back. But that world was gone, and Soviet power was fading alongside it. The PLO and Lebanese National Movement held out, but the civilian devastation proved to be too much. The PLO ultimately agreed to evacuate thousands of its fighters from the country in exchange for a guarantee from the United States that Palestinian civilians would be protected. Instead of respecting such a deal after the withdrawal, Israel oversaw its Phalangist allies orchestrating a brutal massacre of thousands of Palestinian refugees and Lebanese poor in the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps. The Palestinian Revolution had, for the time being, received a debilitating setback. That also closed a chapter of an era of revolutionary Arab politics that we've dedicated this series to exploring, excavating, and analyzing. Our story began in the early 20th century as Arab thinkers, leaders, and masses confronted the British and French colonial domination imposed in the wake of the First World War. That colonial domination's legacy included the imposition of reactionary monarchies, the orchestration of military coups and imperial invasions, and, at the center of everything, the Zionist settler project that the British launched in Palestine. That legacy, however, also contained the seeds of its own contradictions. One of the most vibrant, tenacious, and varied revolutionary traditions in world history. That tradition, if buried under the weight of tremendous violence, was never eliminated. We've seen it resurface at moments when popular forces rushed back into politics. During the First and Second and Unity Intifadas, in the fight against the American occupation of Iraq, in Tahrir Square, and the wave of Arab revolutions after the global financial crash. It's a tradition that we see today in the endurance and resistance of Palestinians, who teach us again and again what it means to live in dignity and what a liberated future might look like. Before we get started, please support The Dig at patreon.com/thedig. This is a political education project. The Dig in general, and Thawra very much in particular. I hope if you've been listening along this whole time that you have learned as much as I have. That's why there's no paywall. We want everyone possible to listen. And the reason that works quite wonderfully is because many of you who are listening voluntarily donate. We also have books, tote bags, mugs to send you in the mail as a thank you, depending on where you live and how much you contribute. And all contributors everywhere get our newsletter delivered straight to your email inbox. But again, the real reason to contribute is just that's how it works. Your voluntary donations make it all happen. Please take a quick moment to support The Dig and Thawra now. That's patreon.com/The Dig. Okay, here's Abdel Razzaq Takriti, who teaches history at Rice University, a scholar of Arab and Palestinian revolutionary movements. He's the author of Monsoon Revolution, Republicans, Sultans, and Empires in Oman, and the co-author of the Palestinian Revolution Digital Humanities website. And that website, I am very happy to report, it's back up and running. There's a link in the show notes. Check it out. It's incredible. Even in the face of a United States with this foreign policy utterly hostile to the Palestinian cause, in the mid-1970s, Fatah, the DFLP, and other groups led the PLO toward diplomatic negotiations that included the possibility of establishing a Palestinian state on just a portion of historic Palestine, something far short of the liberation of the entirety of Palestine and the establishment of a secular democratic state for all. And this generated major opposition, led by the PFLP, which alongside other factions established what was known as the Rejectionist Front, or in full, the Front of Palestinian Forces Rejecting Surrenderist Solutions. How did questions around diplomacy and rejectionism emerge and then play out between different Palestinian factions, between various Palestinian communities and constituencies in and around historic Palestine and around the world, and also between the various Arab states that made it their business to be deeply involved in internal Palestinian politics, countries like Syria and Iraq?
So the main thing that happens, and we've hinted at that already, is that after 73, there is all this approach towards solutionism in the region. There are all sorts of solutions being proposed, and these are focused on creating peace agreements between the Arab states and Israel, and of course, as we mentioned, excluding the PLO. So the PLO wages a diplomatic campaign that has one dimension, which is gaining recognition. Of course, it succeeds in doing that through gaining recognition in the Arab League and then getting recognition in the UN. But then the other thing that is happening is that, of course, it's also trying to get a seat at the table. And to do that, it has to deal with the established formula that the Arab states have accepted. And the Arab states had accepted the established formula of UN Resolution 242, unfortunately for the Palestinians. So, which is a resolution that is primarily focused on the territories that were occupied in 1967. Of course, all of these documents could be interpreted in a colonial and in an anti-colonial way. And what we want in our interpretations of 242 is to interpret it as far as possible in an anti-colonial manner, saying that actually the vague formulation as to what constitutes the territories means that they may also include the territories that were occupied in 48. And indeed, the main British character that pushed it for the resolution was claiming that that's why he adopted a vague formulation in English. In the French version, of course, of UN Resolution 242, there's a more specific formulation that refers to not territories occupied in 1967. It says there has to be withdrawal from the territories. In any case, the PLO had to engage then with this reality, where the whole regional neighborhood is going down that track, especially with the states neighboring it. And primarily, Egypt and Syria, the two most important. With the Syrians accepting that formulation, the Palestinians were left in a weak position because they knew that King Hussein accepts the formulation already. The Egyptians were definitely under Sadat accepting that formulation. There had already been an acceptance of that formulation even earlier. Okay, so now it just gets even more enshrined. And there were talks of a peace conference in Geneva that would include these Arab states and the Israelis. There were all sorts of talks. There was all this shuttle diplomacy that was going on that Kissinger was launching. So from the Palestinian angle, it became important to have a political program that reflected these transformations regionally. And because the idea was, if such a political program was not developed, then the Palestinians were going to end up with nothing. That was the fear of Yasser Arafat in particular, who saw this from the perspective of the regional balance of power. That's how he read everything. He'd never fancied ideology. He was not a particularly ideological person. And for him, the people who were saying, no, we should just fight a long-term people's war and we will achieve our objectives, which is primarily the PFLP, that, you put the principle and you just fight for it to the very end. You don't adjust it. And you don't adjust your political program. From the Abu Ammar's end, he was like, okay, we have to deal with the reality here. I've talked about this before, but I think he had a severe case of chronophobia. There's this fear of time. There was this fear of repeating the Mufti's position, which, of course, the Mufti did the right thing from point of view of principle by rejecting the partition resolution in 47. But in terms of the pragmatic dimension, Palestinians did end up losing a lot of land. I'm not saying that they wouldn't have lost all of it regardless, and they probably would have lost all of it regardless given the prevailing balance of power at the time, but nevertheless, they would have had a better shot at preserving some of it, had there been, a different position in relation to that, potentially. You never know. So that was the thinking that Arafat had. Now, there was another way of thinking about it, which came from the left. And here we're talking about the DFLP. They had undertaken the position that a genuine Marxist analysis would have to be based on reality. And they were saying that a genuine Leninist position would consider that detachment from the prevailing balance of power is a form of infantile leftism. So their idea was that basically, if you had the Soviet Union itself accept Brest-Litovsk, really an agreement which lost the Soviet Union enormous amounts of land, then the same could apply to this case. It's and for them, they were saying for Palestine that you should not commit to accepting the loss of land. But the formulation they came up with was that you establish a state on any bit of land that is liberated. So that was the formulation they came up with. And they emphasized that it would be a fighting state. So the formulation was, any land that's liberated by the revolution, you establish a state on it, and then that's a fighting state that would be used as a base to liberate more land. They were arguing that would be the more realistic option and the more progressive one. Now, and this Palestinian arena was not detached also from external influences. And there was strong support for such a move, of course, from the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union had been pushing in that direction. Let's say the Soviet policy was different. Had the Soviet Union been supportive of a single democratic state solution, believe me, I don't think that the PLO would have come up with a 10-point program that adopted this vision of establishing a state. The other dimension is the Arab states. So Syria was initially not against this, but later on it changes its mind. It adopts a different stance. And Jordan was certainly not against it, although, of course, relations between the PLO and Jordan were terrible at the time. But the whole regional environment, of course, Egypt was not against it. So you had the situation where regionally there were also factors pushing the PLO in that direction. Now, on the PFLP side and other formations that were connected to it, they initially accepted the 10-point program, but then they had a major fallout within the PFLP over it. And of course, in some ways, the same was happening in Fatah, by the way. Like, this program had to be passed in sneaky ways, and it faced major opposition. And I'll give you one example. The Women's Union, which was led by a Fatah person, my departed friend, May Sayegh, she basically confronted the leader of her party and said, we vehemently rejected. All the women in the Women's Union had a unified position on this. It rejected entirely the 10-point program. Which was a humiliation for Yasser Arafat, to have his own representatives in something like that agree with the PFLP representatives on a common policy of rejecting the 10-point program was a big deal. Other Fatah cadres, rank and file, they had serious problems with this. And they developed within Fatah a left that was rejecting this. It was saying that the only pathway is a revolutionary pathway, that there has to be a rejection of all these solutions. So it became very tense. And especially after the PFLP changed its initial position of accepting this and then went into rejecting it. They saw this as a way to liquidate the Palestinian cause, by the way.
It's easy for people on the left, probably for many listeners, this podcast to say in retrospect that of course the radicals were right, that Fatah was wrong to move toward what would obviously be a capitulation to their enemies. But these sorts of questions are genuinely difficult to answer in the moment when they must be answered. This is really the practical essence of politics, that the answers to these questions should be guided by ideology, but really ideology doesn't provide the actual answer. You need to use the ideology to assess the conjuncture, the objective conditions, as best you can.
Right, and it's and that's of course in evidence given the fact that you had such a severe difference of opinion amongst Marxists on this, and we're talking about committed ones. I mean, if you were in the Democratic Front, these were genuine Marxists at the time. In fact, they came from the left of the movement of Arab nationalists. Their split with the PFLP was over them accusing the PFLP of being traditional nationalists, not genuine Marxists. Okay, so and those folks, and I've talked to them about this. I mean, I've interviewed a bunch of them. One of them is, of course, Qais Abdel Karim, who actually wrote down the 10-point program. I have a long interview with him that is available online. By the way, we have it on the Learn Palestine YouTube channel, which is connected to Palestinian Revolution website. And in his case, he's, of course, an Iraqi cadre, by the way, on a side note, and that tells you about the internationalism that was prevailing and the strong Arab connections within, he's the number 2 person in the FLP, but he comes from Iraq, very committed. And he comes for ideological reasons. This is somebody who believes in Marxism very deeply and views it from that lens. Others who also were committed Marxists had a different position. You had major debates over it. But nobody could ever claim that position was based on principles. That's the issue here. And that's the difficulty for a Palestinian in relation to this. How do you come to a people that has been enslaved, occupied, dispossessed, completely destroyed, and now, of course, subjected to logics of elimination and all sorts, and tell them, okay, you have to adjust to reality, and reality says that you have to give away 78% of your land. That's a very difficult thing to do. So as a result, you always had a different tradition in Palestine that was saying, first of all, this is a trick. Americanization means Israelization. It's a trick. And there's no seriousness in applying anything like that. But secondly, if that puts then a ceiling on Palestinian liberation, then it's not worth the price. And that's why there was such a deep division over this. There was fear that it would mean that the refugees would lose their rights. It was fear that this would lead to 1948 Palestinians losing their rights. There was fear that it would lead to a mini state that is dominated and controlled by Israel in the West Bank and Gaza. All of these were serious fears and equally realistic as the balance of power that was prevailing.
Given that Fatah by the late 1960s was calling for a singular democratic state for all, and that by the 1970s they were willing to at least temporarily concede the loss of 78% of historic Palestine to the Zionist settler state known as Israel, from which they had been ethnically cleansed. Given all that, how is it then that Palestinians get consistently painted as the rejectionist party vis-a-vis Israel, very much to this day? By contrast, of course, Israel and the U.S. have constantly rejected anything short of full capitulation from Palestinians. And indeed, as we'll discuss in our epilogue, that's what Israel and the U.S. really finally secured through the Oslo Accords. But how did this upside down world painting of Palestinians as the party that refuses to negotiate get painted?
Well, it's a byproduct of Orientalism, racism, settler colonial thinking, and we've seen it before. I mean, how many times have indigenous peoples in this country been painted as rejectionists, as being non-cooperative, as people who only understand the role of force? How many times were the ANC accused in South Africa, why are you opposing Bantustans? That's very reasonable self-rule, and you'll get your own states and you'll get like arrangements, so you have this is part of the racist colonial way of viewing the world. In the case of Palestine, however, it's promoted by this social and political movement that we've referred to, which is Zionism, in extreme ways, because they keep pumping it out. It's a way of structuring the way we view the world around us. So there are parameters that are set around Israel, and you're not allowed to think of it in any different way. One aspect of it is Israel is generous, the Arabs are rejectionists. The Arabs never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. Palestinians are just hostile to Israeli existence. The Israeli state has a right to exist. They create all of these axioms. And then somehow the whole conversation becomes a conversation around the existential status of the state of Israel, not the Israeli people, okay, not the Jewish people as a whole, not anybody. It becomes a state. Somehow we're all supposed to either preserve this ideological state and enhance it and support it, or we're being rejectionists. And this is of course, super horrific, but it is part of also how the imperial logic of power works. In other parts of the world, the U.S. empire has done this as well. There was twisting of reality in Vietnam. There was twisting of reality in many other parts of the world. But in settler colonial context, particularly in contexts like that of the Israeli state, it becomes more intense. And when you have a huge amount of intellectuals working on behalf of this project, committed to it, out of commitment and love for the project, they'll come and engage in all sorts of sophistry. Honestly, sophistry is the best way to think about this. These are rhetorical conceits.
1974 marked a major diplomatic event for the PLO, with Arafat delivering his landmark speech to the UN General Assembly. In the speech, he placed the Palestinian struggle in the context of armed national liberation movements across the Third World, struggles that had already been victorious, like Algeria, and those that remained in progress, like those across Southern Africa. And really interestingly and movingly, he painted a picture of a future liberated Palestine by first celebrating the anti-Zionist revolutionary socialist Jewish Israeli Ehud Adiv, who had been imprisoned by Israel alongside other members of a group called the Revolutionary Communist Alliance Red Front. He also celebrated Catholic Archbishop Hilarion Capucci, who had been imprisoned by Israel for smuggling weapons to the PLO in the West Bank. And Arafat in the speech declared, quote, "Let us work together that my dream may be fulfilled, that I may return with my people out of exile, there in Palestine, to live with this Jewish freedom fighter and his partners, with this Arab priest and his brothers, in one democratic state where Christian, Jew, and Muslim live in justice, equality, and fraternity." And notably, the camera, at least in the video I watched, pans the room, and Israel's seat in the General Assembly is empty, and so is South Africa's. And Arafat famously concludes the speech by saying, quote, "Today I have come bearing an olive branch and a freedom fighter's gun do not let the olive branch fall from my hand. I repeat, do not let the olive branch fall from my hand. What was the significance of this moment in terms of what it revealed about the Palestinian struggle and also, more broadly, in terms of what it reflected about the UN General Assembly becoming, during this era, this powerful tribune for third worldism and decolonization and really remaking the world along very different lines?
Yeah. So, one interesting fact to note here is that the UN had played this role earlier, was starting to play this role in the 50s. There's a lot of work that has been done on Algeria, for example, and the usage of the UN arena. And interestingly, of course, we've mentioned this in previous episodes. Ahmed al-Shuqairi, the founder of the PLO, helped in that battle, in the diplomatic battle for Algeria in the UN. As more and more African and Asian nations began to gain their independence and join the UN, the character of that organization changed substantially. And that's why, for example, you would have never had a partition resolution of Palestine had that vote taken place a few years later, not in 47, had it taken place, like, let's say, in 53 or 54, would have been a completely different environment.
It took place in a UN General Assembly where much of the world, because of direct colonization, remained disenfranchised in this world body.
Absolutely correct. And one of the more interesting facts about the 1974 speech by Yasser Arafat was that the reason why it could happen, of course, was due to the Algerian presidency of the General Assembly at the time. Algeria, of course, throughout played a big role. Even, by the way, the Algerians under Boumediene played a big role in facilitating the PLO recognition vote that previous year. They facilitated from 73 onwards an Arab situation that would create that. They had been just very steadfast in supporting Palestinian efforts, period. And that's due to that special relationship that we've alluded to over and over again. It's a very real thing, by the way, anti-colonial solidarity. A lot of people question it, but anybody who's been to Algeria and comes from Palestine, anybody who's been to Ireland and comes from Palestine nowadays will feel it, and vice versa. I believe there is an unspoken understanding between peoples who've experienced this, and of course South Africa. I mean, look at what South Africans have done in the international court and elsewhere. This is a true and real thing. But in any case, you have this speech given. I actually consider it to be one of the greatest speeches of all time. It is anybody. I recommend that our listeners read it, and that's not because Arafat was a great orator. He was not. He's actually notorious in Palestinian circles for not being the best orator by any measure. However, the speech was representing the Palestinian people in very significant ways, and the best Palestinian talent went into phrasing it, formulating it. Mahmoud Darwish played a big role in this. Of course, Edward Said had a role in the English version. These were superb writers and intellectuals, and it comes out of that collective spirit. Sometimes, by the way, there's this thinking around speeches of this kind as products of individual genius. What's beautiful about this speech is that it actually did represent the people through the voices of great intellectuals that crafted it for the national representative, who was, of course, the chairman of the PLO. But he did something remarkable there. And I think it communicated the Palestinian position in very significant ways, because it actually communicated the principle. In that speech, there's so much richness. The setting up actually the settler colonial context and the comparative settler colonial context. It's there. A lot of people sometimes claim, well, settler colonial analysis came after the establishment of the Journal of Settler Colonial Studies in 2011. I'm like, what the hell are you talking about?
That's the weirdest new thing that people who, I don't know, write for the Atlantic magazine are saying. It's so weird.
Or Eric Wolf, or Patrick Wolf, or whoever, and it's like, it's not when Eric Wolf writes about peasant insurrections it's not when Patrick Wolf writes about comparative settler colonialism or anything like that. It comes much earlier from the revolutions and the revolutionary movements themselves. So Anyways, so there is that dimension. There is, again, this emphasis on a joint vision, a vision of a joint future for Palestinians, for Jews, for Arabs of different faiths in this land, for people who fought for an international vision in different ways. It's a wonderful, wonderful document. At the same time as this document, though, was being proposed, of course, we had the 10-point program simultaneously in operation. But what is interesting about this period is there's an ambiguity in the 10-point program. And that's a byproduct, of course, of the internal Palestinian arena. You couldn't come and say, like, even Arafat couldn't do it in Fatah, and even somebody with his weight and enormous influence. And he was the weightiest Palestinian figure in modern Palestinian history that way. He couldn't push something like that so early on, like saying two-state solution. And I don't think he wanted to. There was a sort of a vagueness that allowed for that possibility should there be an international process, but that also gave an uncommitted approach to this thing. Now, all of this, by the way, then gets disrupted by the Lebanese civil war, which I'm sure you'll ask about.
Yeah, that's what I want to talk about now. Lebanon, where civil war broke out again in 1975 and 76. It was the beginning of a long, complex, multifaceted conflict, which pitted the PLO and its leftist Lebanese allies against right-wing Maronite Christian phalangists. A conflict that would last for a decade and a half and that would at various points draw in Syria, Israel, and the United States. We've discussed some of this background in prior episodes, but let's get into the proximate situation here in 1975 and 76 before we discuss how it all plays out. Why does the Lebanese civil war explode when it does and the way that it does? And what sort of situation does that put the PLO in? Because as we discussed with regard to Black September in Jordan, Fatah had a principle of non-intervention in the internal affairs of Arab states, while the left-wing PFLP and DFLP supported the revolutionary overthrow of reactionary governments across the Arab world, and all of this within a context where there are conflictual dynamics between a nation-state subject to Israeli reprisals and a stateless people waging an armed liberation struggle against Israel, the settler state right next door.
Right. So Daniel, the difficulty with the analysis of Lebanese civil war is that there's so many different perspectives on it that have nothing to do with Palestinian realities. And actually, the current Lebanese analysis of it in the internal Lebanese arena is almost premised on not actually having a serious analysis of it and just laying the blame on Palestinians or others. The best example of that is that this was a quote, a guerre pour les autres, which is a war for the others, as Ghassan Toueni, the famous Lebanese journalist, put it. In reality, of course, there were internal Lebanese dynamics that led to this war. The development of Lebanese capital had to do with the story. Lebanon had increasingly developed in the 1950s as an alternative to the port trade that had existed in Haifa and Palestine. Beirut took that trade. It became also the main banking center for the region, a region that was expanding in oil reserves. And it was very much depending on that, on relationships with a global economic project that had ties to the US, and had tied to countries that were related to the US, to Gulf capital and so on in the region. So it became like a transit hub and a hub for financial services. That benefited, of course, a certain type of bourgeoisie there. And it's a certain type of bourgeoisie that did not want to be aligned with the sort of socialist projects that were being promoted by Nasser and Syria and others. That's on the one hand. Then you have the sectarian dimension. Okay, the sectarian dimension that we've talked about over and over again there, and I think our listeners understand it by now. But it meant that you had a Maronite elite that were opposed to any form of an adjustment to the arrangement that had been done by the French in terms of the allocation of political power in the country. So you had the Maronite president, you had the Maronite head of army, You had the distribution of power disproportionately benefiting them. And, of course, the Sunnis were the junior partner in this. They got some of the seats, but they were never able to break that hegemony. Other groups didn't get anything. So we have this problem internally going on. And we saw it explode, of course, in the 1950s. Now, what is the solution after 58? Shihabism, which is building a strong Lebanese state. And again, a state that would defend capital, protect capital, expand capital, while at the same time not necessarily clash with surrounding Arab states. So it was built on an arrangement with Nasser even. And additionally, that would have some kind of element of building a new national identity, a unifying national identity. All of this came at the expense of Palestinians, though, in this final phase, because they were completely disregarded in this project, and in fact, they were subjected to extra security surveillance and oppression in this period. So by the time the Palestinian Revolution comes, a new variable is entering that allows for changing the map there. One, all the groups that had been marginalized by the sectarian system, and I'm here talking about sectarian groups, the major sects that didn't get what they saw as their fair share of the pie, or that did not want to have a sharing of the pie model at all based on sectarian lines, they saw a potential in the arrival of this phenomena, which is the Palestinian Revolution, because this brings in people who are armed, people who have a revolutionary vision, people who have radical ideas. At the same time, you have the Lebanese right, and especially the Maronite forces that were identified with the right. They're seeing this as a menace. It's a very dangerous thing. It changes their own situation internally in terms of the balance of power. And this causes a serious issue that leads to major explosion internally. Now, another thing that needs to be added, and this is something that one of the most wonderful people I've served on doctoral committee for, Dr. Nathaniel George, who teaches now at the University of London at SOAS. He calls this a global civil war what took place. It's not just a civil war. It's actually a global one. And he emphasizes the fact that the right was very much infused with actually American and capitalist ideas. The main theorist of the right was very close actually to American civilizational discourse. He had excellent relations with the American right, with heads of major companies, Coca-Cola, etc. All of these people were telling him he's a great visionary. This is Charles Malik, of course. And I believe that Nate is publishing a major piece on him, and it's going to appear in the American Historical Review. So I encourage our readers to check it. But basically, there is very much a civilizational framing of this. And it's very much framed as a clash between capitalism and communism, a clash between the forces of Christianity and Islam, a clash between civilization and darkness. These binaries play out big time in the way the ideological engineering of the war took place. What is very important to also note is there were reasons why this war could happen internationally. The Maronite leadership sensed that they could draw upon external support to be able to make this happen. And had they not believed that, they would not have carried it out.
So how does the war start, and how would you characterize the basic camps of the conflict? It was a sectarian war, obviously, but only one side embraced violent sectarianism. The PLO and its allies absolutely rejected it.
The war started with a bus that was carrying Palestinian civilians, actually, Palestinians in a bus. They were going on a trip. They passed through a Maronite Christian area, and they get massacred in that bus. So that actually becomes the initial event that leads to the explosion of the fighting. Now, of course, there's many things that happen in the lead up to that, but this results in a situation where you have a process of attacks on the part of Maronite forces, also on neighborhoods that are seen as being within the orbit of Christian majority areas and that are mixed ethnically. Mixed stories, sectarian, mixed sects, like it's mixed religiously, but also may contain Palestinians. So they're attacking systematically these areas, and actually they're engaging in a project of sectarian cleansing in them. So the idea is to create some form of Christian separateness within Lebanon, and to enforce also within Christian communities a certain ideological conformity. So let's say you're a Christian, but you belong to the Communist Party or you belong to the left, and there were many examples of this. Your house would be demolished, or your family would be attacked, or there would be forms of essentially ensuring that you're destroyed. So the progress of the war depended on a series of events that were connected to these kind of practices. And this is something that is very clear to me. There was no equivalent ideology or policy on the other side, because you did have the Lebanese National Movement, which was the main alliance running the Lebanese side of the Lebanese Civil War. That was representing progressive parties for the most part, that either belonged to the communist wing of the Arab Liberation Movement that we've been talking about all these weeks, or the nationalist one. But the nationalists, of course, had undergone a process of radicalization. So it included all the Nasserists, the Baathists, the communists. It was a broad umbrella that included all of these forces. Plus, of course, Kamal Jumblat, who was the Druze leader, and that represented a party called the Progressive Socialist Party. Now, those forces were claiming to be anti-sectarian, and there's no reason not to believe that. They did not have an idea of sectarian cleansing, certainly not the communists or the Nasserists or the Baathists. And they were mixed in terms of sectarian background. The same was the case in the Palestinian Revolution, which is, of course, was the muscle behind this movement at this stage, at the early stage of the war. So on the Palestinian side, when we talked about DFLP and PFLP regularly throughout, they're both led by Christian figures, for example. But they did not buy this idea. Naif Hawatmeh and George Habash did not believe that, that this was a fight between Christianity and Islam. They believed that this was a fight actually between a narrow vision of what they called in'izaliyya, isolationism, and a broader integration and regional unity, which of course they were favoring. So that's how they characterize this fight. They saw it as a manipulation of minority causes towards establishing a minoritarian vision that was separatist and along sectarian lines. So they deeply rejected this. They also saw it as deeply tied with certain interests of capital that use populist forces towards their own agendas. So that is their analysis of it. Of course, in the case of Fatah, as you've seen with Yasser Arafat, and you've read parts of his speech, Yasser Arafat was very keen on promoting ecumenical visions. He was not a secularist like Hawatmeh and Habash, but he spoke all the time about, Muslim, Christian brotherhood, he took it further after this unified national state program. He talked about Jewish brotherhood. He had the all-encompassing vision of this is the Holy Land that we're fighting for, that represents everybody. A very ecumenical approach. So that was his tendency, and that is the official position of all the major Palestinian movements in this war.
How does this early phase of the Lebanese civil war actually play out? And specifically, why does Syria, which has forces in the country, why does Assad's purportedly radical anti-imperialist Syria sell out its allies, the PLO and the left-wing Lebanese National Movement, and instead side with the right-wing Maronites? Ultimately, during this period of the war, phalangists carried out a massacre in the East Beirut Palestinian refugee camp of Tel el-Zatar, right under the eyes of Syrian troops. How did this phase of the war play out, and what specifically did this reveal about Assad's Syria in terms of its relationship to the emerging political situation in Lebanon and about its desire to control the PLO and about its relationships with Iraq, Israel, the United States, the Soviet Union?
Yeah, so on the Syrian front, Daniel, we have this very perverse situation, which is, of course, connected to the overall geopolitical fight that was carried out by Syria at this stage. When the Syrians were observing what was happening in Lebanon, they've noticed that the alliance that was led by the PLO, basically the Lebanese National Movement plus the PLO forces, had essentially taken over almost 3/4 of the country, if not a bit more. They were on the pathway to victory. The PLO was much stronger than these Maronite militias. The Lebanese National Movement was also gaining strength, and in the various battles that took place between 1975, the outbreak of the war, and 1976, the moment of Syrian intervention, the forces of the what the PLO called the isolationists were actually losing major ground. That meant that they turned to Syria. From Hafez al-Assad's perspective, Lebanon was going to be a Syrian sphere of influence as far as he's concerned. This was not a file that he was willing to give to the PLO or anybody else. Secondly, he did not want greater PLO autonomy. Should the PLO control or play a leading role in Lebanese politics, as far as he's concerned, that would mean that it would gain in its independence from Syria. And he was worried that Yasser Arafat was not actually towing the Syrian line in relation to the broader negotiations process that was going internationally. And here we go back into the distrust between different state leaders and major conflicts. Remember, Hafez al-Assad came out of the 73 war being very embittered with his partner in the war, Anwar Sadat, who, Hafez thought that Anwar would keep on going with the fighting and would allow, therefore, the Syrian army to do greater achievements on the Golan front. Now, the Syrian army was disappointed because it had to, with the Egyptian moves that did not were not as aggressive as they should have been from a Syrian perspective. The Israelis were allowed to actually regain momentum and to push back the Syrian forces. So now he did want to go into the negotiation process that was initiated by Kissinger and the Americans, but he was feeling that increasingly what Kissinger was doing was isolating the Egyptians, taking them in a different direction, and the Syrians were being left out. And he's noticing another pattern, which is Yasser Arafat is refusing to put all his eggs in the Syrian basket. And that's the demand that Hafez has of him, is you stand with us in this regional arena fully, and you don't go with the you don't indicate any engagement with the Sadat side of it. And of course, Yasser Arafat has a different outlook. His main fear was always that you'd have greater Syrian control over the internal Palestinian arena, and he doesn't want to be just a tool of whatever regime there is in Syria. He has a deep understanding of Syrian politics. And he's experienced it. He spent time there. He got imprisoned there. So as we know from previous episodes, so his outlook is, but he's also equally extremely connected to Egypt, much more connected to Egypt. Of course, he grew up there and has enormous understanding of the Egyptian arena. So he's trying to balance the two, and that's not the demand that's coming from Hafez. Hafez wants a situation in Lebanon where nobody wins, and that he makes that clear. He wants a situation in Lebanon where Gamal Jumblat's declared objective or program, which was as the head of the Lebanese National Movement, of overthrowing the sectarian system. He doesn't want that, because that means then that the country would not be in his orbit. and could take a very different direction than his. One more dynamic that needs to be brought into the equation, and this is something that the people closer to Assad will emphasize to his credit, according to them, is that they saw the potential threat of a victory in that for these movements as providing an excuse for the Israelis to strike an alliance with the Maronites, and then to encourage some kind of an insurgency that would be an Israeli-led one. And might lead to then threatening Syrian national security. So there are all sorts of complex dynamics in this, Daniel. Now, what happens next, however, is that, of course, the Israelis want to weaken the PLO. And of course, the Americans love this idea. And therefore, you have this situation where the Americans encourage and bless the idea that is proposed to them by Hafez al-Assad of a Syrian entry into Lebanon to support and back the Maronites and weaken the PLO. And the documents, by the way, speak openly in these terms. Those negotiations take place. They're available now for people who want to check them out. You can find them in the American National Archives. And the gist of it is the Americans give their blessing for this move, and of course the Israelis through them communicate their support for it, because it's a major blow to the PLO if you have this entry. Now, the Syrian entry was supposed to be much more comprehensive. It could have led to the destruction of the PLO as a whole. They suffered major military losses. They, for example, tried to take over Saida, and there they get bombarded with RPGs, their tanks. They enter like many tanks, and dozens of them get destroyed by PLO fighters. Nevertheless, they're able to enter there into Lebanon, and by doing so, they prevent the fall of the Maronite forces, and they weaken the position of the PLO. They further facilitate attacks on the part of those forces against Palestinian refugee camps. And that's where the Tel al-Za'atar massacre happens, for example, which leads to the killing of thousands of Palestinians.
One quite shocking note about this period that I kept coming across, the PLO actually provided crucial security to U.S. personnel in Lebanon, all while the U.S. was the principal sponsor of Israel and refused to even officially speak to the PLO, let alone recognize it. What was going on there?
So there was a track that was opened by Yasser Arafat. He really wanted engagement with the U.S. Okay, he saw that the U.S. was leading the process in the diplomatic process in the region. It was not the Soviet Union that was in the driver's seat, and although he was becoming close to the Soviets, he wanted to keep also a channel open to the Americans. At this stage, the Americans were refusing to talk to the PLO, obviously, but what you did have was the availability of establishing some contacts through security organizations, especially the CIA. I know that our listeners will find this weird, but the CIA actually had more openness in relation to the PLO than any of the diplomats in Washington. It's generally actually the intelligence services are not by necessity the most extreme ones, and neither are the military ones. My colleague, Bob Bizanko, he wrote about Vietnam in relation to this in the military establishment in Vietnam. And he wrote the radical history of that. But he showed basically that actually the political establishment in Washington was far worse than the security establishment on these questions. Not because the security establishments are good, but it's because they have something to lose on the ground. Their job is to run empirical calculations based on realities on the ground and so on. They do assessments in a different way. So in any case, the attempt to open up these channels took place through major Palestinian leader Ali Hassan Salameh, who was a Fatah leader that was entrusted with certain types of security operations of this kind. By the way, he's a figure that attracts a lot of attention because he was a good-looking guy, used to go to the gym, was married to Miss Lebanon, Georgina Reza, this fabulous character. But he had all these kind of engagements, and the Israelis, of course, assassinate him as a result because they do not want the opening of a front where the PLO is talking directly to the Americans. He cultivates a lot of relations with the CIA through giving them So creating a series of like quid pro quos and different engagements. I give you some info here, you give me info, that kind of level of work.
I want to briefly pivot back to the struggle within the 48 territories and then also the 67 territories, because it was within the State of Israel on March 30th, 1976, that the first ever Land Day protests by Palestinian citizens took place. What is Land Day and how did it begin? And what does it reveal about the situation of Palestinians struggling against the Israeli state from within the 48 territories and relatedly also in the newly occupied territories of Gaza, East Jerusalem, and the West Bank throughout the 1970s?
So Land Day is a very important event because it restores to the heart of the Palestinian scene those Palestinians that were occupied in 1948 and that were, of course, for many years cut off from their compatriots, who were living in the 67 occupied territories or elsewhere in the Arab world. And in some cases, they were even accused of betrayal for becoming Israeli citizens, were accused of, all sorts of mean things, even though, of course, they never wanted to be Israeli citizens. They never wanted to have Israeli rule over their heads. They were, in fact, the people that managed to survive the Nakba, stay on the land, and by doing so, they became a thorn on the side of Zionism. That population comprises almost a fifth of the population of the Israeli state. These Palestinian citizens of Israel were subjected to military rule, as we mentioned before in previous episodes, until 1966. From between 48 and 66, they're subjected to all these awful acts. They continue to be treated as third-class citizens to this very day. And one of the most awful forms of discrimination, but also assaults on them, settler colonial assaults, was the expropriation of land. And you had this project of expropriating land, of course, from the very beginning, and it took place over many different phases. But in 1976, there was a big project to even expropriate way more than before. Was framed as part of a plan to Judaize the Palestinian areas in regions like the Galilee, in which there was still a large Palestinian presence. In 76, one of the government decisions was to confiscate huge amounts of land towards these kind of racist visions, racist settler colonial visions. In order to do that, they had to impose curfew on the major villages in the area that was going to be affected by this expropriation. So, you had Sikhnin, Deir Hanna, Tamra, Rabi, and Kabul, these villages, they get subjected to this. This is when you had a call, and a political call, in which the leaderships actually of the Communist Party played a big role, especially the mayor of Nazareth, of Nasr, Tawfiq Zayyad, the well-known poet and the communist mayor of Nasr. They called for a day of action against this. Demonstrations took place. People went out in a very strong way to fight this land grab, this theft of land. People were killed by Israeli forces because colonists never respect the lives of the colonized, as we know very well, even if they're given citizenship. And therefore you had the killing of 6 martyrs. You also had the killing of children. Most of the people that were actually killed were or all of them were under 25. I mean, this is the sad reality. That day, Yom al-Ard, Land Day, became an important event in the Palestinian calendar. As soon as it happened, the PLO actually adopted this as part of its message of the unity of the Palestinian people, because it was a magnanimous event in the sense that it restored the position of 48 Palestinians. It showed that there's Palestinians everywhere subjected to colonialism, but that they're also fighting it, and they're fighting on their land for their land in this case. So you have all these PLO posters that are produced on Land Day. You have songs. This famous singer Abu Arab, who was one of the great singers of the revolution, he sang Kermalak Ya Yom Al Ard. All of these songs that were done for Yom Al Ard, for Land Day, came out in that period. It was an incredible event that way, and it continues to be commemorated. And of course, the commemoration takes many different forms. Poets write about it. Mahmoud Darwish, the great poet, wrote about it. And every year on the 30th of March, we mark it. Coinciding with what was going on inside the 1948 areas of Palestine, it had an impact on 6-7 territories, because you had this intensification of feeling of the unity of the Palestinian people. And it led to mobilizations also there in support of those that had come out to defend their land on Land Day, in support of those that had fallen. And this is quite significant because, of course, in the 70s, the Israelis were pursuing a policy in the occupied territories of encouraging quietism. So you had this dimension where they were trying as much as possible to create conditions that would prevent the eruption of major revolts there. Of course, that policy was to change, but this was the overall focus in the 1970s, to prevent the PLO from establishing a strong mobilization, and at the same time to encourage an economic policy which would allow for labor engagements with 1967 territories, occupied territories, which would allow for economic openings or morphine shots to people to stay quiet. So there was always mobilization in the 67 territories, despite this policy. And throughout the 70s, what we see is this constant process of different Palestinian Fida'i groups from outside establishing a strong presence on the ground in the West Bank and Gaza. So in Gaza, for example, throughout the early 70s, you have that phenomena called Guevara Gaza, which is, a PFLP cadre who is nicknamed Guevara after Che Guevara, of course. He had led a series of operations against Israeli forces. These were armed operations, and many of them were very successful. They also targeted Israeli operatives that came from Palestine, but that were working as collaborators. Of course, Guevara gets killed, and his members of his cell get arrested. That was a big phenomena in the history of Palestinian resistance in the occupied territories in the 70s. In the West Bank, you had so many mobilizations in East Jerusalem, and dozens of people as a result get actually exiled. This was the period when the Israeli solution for the people that were trying to engage in resistance was to exile them and prevent them from coming back. So it was actually really a systematic policy of expulsion that affected hundreds of people that were fighting for freedom in that part of the world. And of course, there was mass imprisonment as well. This was a big aspect of putting down mobilizations in this period. One more thing that was going on politically was that the Israelis were trying to create forms that would undermine the development of PLO allegiance and essentially like mobilization under nationalist leadership.
Essentially forms of indirect rule.
Yes, or forms of, in this case, more like collaborator rule. Yeah, like they were creating projects like, for example, they created this idea of village leagues, people that are connected to them and their collaboration networks, and they would be anti-revolutionary, anti-PLO, anti-national representation. They were also trying to infiltrate different civic bodies and different institutional bodies. And of course, there was a lot of resistance to them on all spheres. But whenever there was resistance, they went very heavy-handed. And so many of the people that tried to resist them were also subjected to violence. So for example, nationalist mayors the patriotic mayors were subjected to attacks, and one of them, for example, Bassam al-Shaka, the mayor of Nablus, was a major nationalist figure, was subjected to a bombing. They almost killed him. He had to receive intensive care and so on. So there are so many examples of Israeli violence in this period.
Hi, this is Olufemi O. Taiwo, and you're listening to The Dig. You can support the podcast at patreon.com.
This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Haymarket Books, which has loads of great left-wing titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is The Black Anti-Fascist Tradition by Janelle K. Hope and Bill V. Mullen. In this landmark book, scholar-activists Hope and Mullen show how generations of Black activists and intellectuals, from Ida B. Wells in the fight against lynching to Angela Y. Davis in the struggle against the prison-industrial complex, have stood within a tradition of Black anti-fascism. They explore the powerful ideas and activism of figures including Claudia Jones, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Amy Césaire, and organizations including the Civil Rights Congress and the Black Liberation Army. In shining a light on the relationship between fascism and anti-Blackness, Hope and Mullen persuasively argue that these writers and organizations developed key tools and strategies for fighting back. Find the Black Anti-Fascist Tradition at haymarketbooks.org, where all paperback books are 20% off every day. 1977 and 1978 marked a massive defeat, not only for Palestinians, but for the entirety of Arab revolutionary politics that we've spent this series discussing. Egyptian President Anwar Sadat did what would have been unthinkable for an Arab head of state. He visited Israel and addressed the Knesset, opening a diplomatic push that in 1978 led to the Camp David Accords, brokered by the United States. Egypt recognized Israel in exchange for Israel's return of the occupied Sinai. Meanwhile, Palestinians were totally sidelined and consigned to this newly horrible reality that Egypt, which under Nasser had led a regional Arab struggle against imperialism, was now normalizing the Zionist settler colonization of Palestine. Sadat's move also, of course, left Syria out because it did nothing to end the occupation of the Golan Heights. How did Camp David come about, and what were its consequences for the region in general and for the PLO and the Palestinian struggle in particular? What did it mean for Egypt to swing from being the leader of the revolution to the vanguard of reaction?
Yeah, so the context of Camp David, Daniel, has to do both with domestic Egyptian factors as well as the international situation prevailing in the 1970s. Domestically, we saw a shift under Sadat from a Nasserist policy, which was committed to a vision in which Egypt's geopolitics would be concentrated on independence and sovereignty. And that means creating some sort of regional formula in which Egypt would play the biggest role, but where the country would derive its strength from having that leadership role, and where it would be able to mobilize regional forces in a coordinated fashion and thus be able to project power in regional and international affairs. And this was, of course, it coincided with a focus on creating a strong non-aligned movement, and that was an effort that Egypt played a big and an important role in under Nasser. Now, Sadat had a different vision. He considered that all the cards in the region were with the United States. He said, America holds all the cards in the Middle East. That's one of his most famous statements. He considered that Egypt's role had to be reconceptualized. Egypt had to enter into the American orbit, and that this would allow it to regain the territories it lost and then also pursue a policy that would take it away from the previous socialist policy that had been adopted by Nasser domestically, and pursue a policy as well that would entail receiving arms from the United States rather than the Soviet Union. So this was about a complete realignment in many ways. And that means realignment in international affairs, but also an abandonment of socialism locally and reintroduction of various forms of capitalism, and reversing many of the reforms that were benefiting the poor in Egypt under Nasser, including land reform that was reversed actually. There was reintroduction of large land ownership, all sorts of other domestic policies were taking on a capitalist character. So that referred to this as the policy of openness and fitah. So we have a lot that was going on. Now, domestically, of course, this also required Sadat to find allies that would be able to support this program, because this is not an easy thing to do, to depart from Nasserism completely after so long. And, Nasser had a great deal of popularity. His funeral was the biggest in modern Arab history. It was, there was an incredible event. There was a lot of love and support for Nasser in Egyptian society and of course beyond. Sadat needed to find allies to marginalize Nasser's forces, so he brought back the Muslim Brotherhood. A lot of them had been in exile in Saudi Arabia, a lot of them had been in jail, but Sadat essentially now was presenting a vision in which Egypt would be the land of the faithful. He was saying, Masr balad al-mu'mineen, it's the land of the faithful. So this also had major social effects, by the way. That period witnessed, besides the introduction or reintroduction of capitalism, a great deal of conservative push. Like there was a growth in social conservatism that accompanied the return of the Muslim Brotherhood. So a lot was going on here. And this was, of course, connected as well to policy around Palestine and the policy that led to Camp David. Because if you're going to Americanize and if you're going to, pursue a closer relationship with the United States, one of the requirements would be to have a close relationship with the Israeli state, or at least to exit from the orbit of conflict with it. And that was the main American focus at the time. Ironically, it was under Jimmy Carter that we saw an intensification of this attempt to get Egypt out of the Arab orbit and to essentially, by doing that, damage the Palestinian cause immeasurably. And I say ironically because later on, Jimmy Carter spent much of his career advocating for a Palestinian state and so on. He wanted some kind of a two-state solution, 1967, along 1967 lines. But in reality, of course, more than any other president, he actually did the most damage to the prospects of that happening by sponsoring this accord that marginalized the Palestinians completely.
It's amazing how much mystification is accomplished by the phrase peace process.
Absolutely. This was never a peace process. This was a process of formalizing the integration of a settler colonial state into a region that was originally hostile to the idea of settler colonization. And that's always been what this so-called peace process is. It's not about rights, it's not about justice, it's not about a common future for the settler colonists and the native people on that land. It's about formalizing and normalizing settler colonization. So in the case of the Egyptian state, it marketed this, and Sadat marketed this by doing a few things. One was to launch a major attack on Nasser and his policies, basically saying, look, Nasser harmed Egypt, Nasser got us into socialism. He got us into these wars that led us nowhere. And that became basically a standard line that you still hear in Egyptian society today, because if you keep on repeating this kind of vision, it will eventually like stick in people's minds. Then you had also an attack on Palestine and the Palestinians. Why are we fighting for them? There was this, Sadat was encouraging this kind of localized Egyptian identity now. So the main focus was on saying that we fought all these wars for Palestinians, and why? Why should we care about them? We are Egyptians. We don't belong to this whole like belonging to an Arab nation was a Nasserist fantasy. We should go down our own path, defend Egypt's interests. Egypt's interests come first. And that's basically the logic that was promoted by Sadat very, very successfully.
In terms of the impacts that this had on the ground in Palestine, I found this one quote from a mayor of a West Bank city that said, quote, "After Camp David, the Israelis felt able to use live ammunition against our demonstrators." How did Camp David just remake the basic dynamics of the struggle between the Palestinian people and the PLO and the Zionist Israeli settler state?
Well, it definitely emboldened the Zionist settler colonial state in major ways, because once you have Egypt exiting the equation, that means that you cannot have a major war waged against the Israeli settler colony. There's a saying, and I might have referred to it earlier in this podcast, that there is no war without Egypt and there is no peace without Syria. That's the usual, that's a very common saying in the Middle East. I think for the most part, it is true. Because you cannot have a situation where the biggest Arab state in terms of population and in terms of military capacity, which is Egypt at the time. Additionally, you have another factor that is very important to focus on, which is there were changes within the Israeli state itself. A settler colonial society was witnessing a shift to the right, believe it or not. Not that there was ever real left there, because this whole idea that Ben Gurion and the party that he established, this Labour Party, was a left-wing party, is a total myth. It is a settler colonial party that adopted some leftist language and some practices that benefited some of the sections of the settler colonial society, but definitely not the native population. But you could always get more insane and hardcore settlers in any settler colonial context. And by insane, I really mean it in the sense of it is actually a mad idea to think that you want to completely eliminate the native population, even beyond the elimination that you've carried out. But that's, of course, the line that really lies at the heart of Zionism. So, all colonialism is madness, but you could get more extreme versions of madness within it.
In this case, Menachem Begin.
Menachem Begin, who is, of course, a follower of Vladimir Jabotinsky, the founder of revisionist Zionism. And Vladimir Jabotinsky's line was, in a way, it's a more honest line than the labor Zionist line. He was the biggest competitor and enemy of Ben Gurion. And his position was, we have to be honest about Palestinian Arabs. They are an indigenous population, and he actually compares them to the populations in Latin America and Australia. And he says, look, like any indigenous population, it will fight back when it's confronted by colonialists. He actually refers, by the way, to the Zionist movement as a colonialist one. This is in his famous booklet, The Iron Wall. And he's like, okay, the only solution for us then is to create such an impossible situation for them, where they're confronted with this iron wall, this Palestinian indigenous population, an overwhelming force that they cannot defeat. And then, they'll bang their heads against the wall until they find that it's futile. And then we impose on them our terms, essentially. So he was saying basically that labor Zionists are in a way lying when they're pretending that let's reach an agreement with the Palestinians, because he's like, that's not what they really want. They want the same thing as us revisionist Zionists, but they're just lying about it, pretending that this is about kumbaya moments and holding hands. It's not. It's about actual force and forcing the native population out, essentially. So when it comes to Begin, he gets elected, and of course, it's under him that we see an intensification of a set of policies that take the political repression to the next level. It had always existed, but he expanded it significantly, and of course, he expanded the geopolitical ambitions of the Israeli settler colonial state in this period, emboldened by Camp David. So we see him, for example, invading Lebanon. That's quite a big deal. It causes a lot of damage.
Before we get to the invasion of Lebanon in 1978, where does Camp David leave Syria, its ally in the 1973, 1967, and 1948 wars with Israel, but which was left with Israel still occupying the Golan Heights within firing distance of Damascus?
Yeah, I mean, this was a big blow for the Syrian government. It was a disaster for them. Even if you accept the concept of a settlement, a peace settlement, along the unjust lines of 1967, even if you want to throw the Palestinians under the bus, okay, and you don't facilitate for the right of return or for an actual, full rights for those Palestinians living in 1948, etc. Even if you do all of that, even if you don't even facilitate for a Palestinian state along 67 lines, what you would want to have if you're Syria is a unified Arab front, a deal that is more comprehensive. Separate deals means that you could end up with a situation. That's what happened in the case of Syria, where you essentially never get back your territory, because alone you're not able to provide the level of direct threat, a military threat, that would force the U.S. to engage with you and to kind of encourage its client state in this case. I mean, it's not exactly a client state, but the state it supports and sponsors in this region to take a different line. So when Egypt and Syria were working together, they did provide that kind of military threat. And of course, we saw that in 1973. But the American solution was, okay, so now we divide them. And one of them, we take the bigger one, we give it back its territories, but in exchange for it exiting this orbit of confrontation with the Israeli state. And essentially, since then, there's been a severe Americanization of Egypt in every sphere. And to this day, we see that, because the Egyptian army receives, of course, the second largest aid package from the United States after the Israeli one. They get, and of course it's much smaller than the Israeli one, but still, compared to other countries, it's pretty big, and it's important for them. They receive their weaponry from the United States. Their main source of supplies now is the U.S. So the U.S. starts playing a huge role in the Egyptian politics and society. That means that Egypt would not support, of course, any Syrian move to regain its territories, because it's out of the equation. Syria wants to find a way around this, and it can't at this stage. It tries various means to regain the Golan, but to this day, of course, things even got worse with Trump recognizing the Golan as Israeli territory. So, yeah, I mean, of course, that's illegal under international law, but it's happening. This process of normalizing the occupation of Syrian lands there.
As you just referenced, in 1978, Israel, under Likud founder and the first Likud prime minister, Menachem Begin, Israel invaded southern Lebanon after years of cross-border fighting with the Palestinian Fedayeen. How did this Israeli invasion come about? How did it fit into the longer history of Israeli reprisals on Lebanese territory? And then, was this something just to be expected of Israel as the Zionist settler state that it was, the belligerent state that it was? Or are there important things here to understand about Begin and his leadership, the direction it was taking Israel?
Yeah, I mean, it's very important to understand Begin for us to understand this period and his entire political current and thinking. Of course, Begin comes from Belarus. That's where he was born. He was born into a family of committed Zionists. And when he ended up moving to Palestine as a colonist, he came under the influence of Jabotinskyist thought. Of course, he was close to that way of thinking. He ended up establishing a major terrorist organization called Irgun. And of course, they carried out numerous attacks against civilians. They introduced, by the way, the idea of bombings into this region, into this part of the world. They bombed numerous markets, buildings. They attacked civilian targets mercilessly. They bombed the King David Hotel. They did a lot of operations of this kind. So they were classified even by the British Empire as engaging in terrorism. Yeah, and Begin played the biggest role in this. They played a huge role in the ethnic cleansing in 1948. They attacked Jaffa, for example. They were behind that. And they were behind driving Jaffa's population out of the city. And Begin was personally responsible for planning that and carrying it out. And this is connected to today's situation in Gaza because, of course, a lot of these refugees did end up in Gaza, and all the refugees south of Jaffa, definitely, a lot of them ended up in Gaza. So Irgun has a long and dark history. Menachem Begin has a long and dark history, and these people were celebrating that history. Netanyahu comes from that lineage. His father was personal secretary to Menachem Begin's mentor, Jabotinsky. And these people, of course, do not even believe that the boundaries of the Israeli state are just between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean. They go beyond from the river to the sea. I mean, they see Jordan as being part of this. Some of them have even a more maximalist vision. They have all sorts of outlooks that are very expansionist at their core. Sometimes out of political realism, they'll say, "Oh well, okay, so we've given away territory to the Palestinians by keeping Jordan as Jordan. That's the Palestinian state." So this way of thinking is very problematic, of course. But I'm not saying that it's, by the way, that it differs in its core in major ways from labor Zionism. It's just a more extreme version of settler colonial ideology. And that's an important point, because sometimes people try to distinguish between them too much, and then they create a fake binary where we're supposed to, condemn the Israeli right, but believe in this myth that there's an Israeli left that we can support. And, that means then whitewashing the crimes of this labor current in Zionism, including some of its leaders that are sometimes celebrated in the West. So people like Rabin, people like Shimon Peres, these were war criminals. These were, people that committed major massacres, and their ideology didn't differ significantly. In any case, we have, therefore, under Begin, a situation where the idea is you have to eliminate the Palestinian presence from the region. That's the strategy that he's focused on. And that means weakening the PLO, combating it, and trying to get it as far away as possible from anywhere bordering the Israeli state. And that meant essentially a focus on Lebanon. Now, Begin begins this policy by claiming that he's engaging in reprisals against Palestinian action, or it was Palestinian Fidai action. We know that this is not true because, every Palestinian action was preceded by an Israeli action. It's not like these things come out of the blue, but also, more importantly, it's in a context of a structural context. where there's a national liberation war, essentially, against the colonial state. So that's the reality. However, in the West, it always comes as a convincing argument. If you come and say, "Well, they just attacked me now, so I have to strike back," and then I strike back like 100 times stronger. But
we were talking earlier about the classic American imagery of the Indian in the cowboy western galloping up to the train to attack it for what reason? Who knows why?
Exactly. And then, of course, the images of savagery, scalping, and so on and so forth, raping of white women. We know these discourses, again, from indigenous struggles in the United States, from African American struggles in the United States. It's always the dangerous black man lurking in the shadows that is attacking the poor whites. And of course, that structurally is the furthest thing from the truth, because it's the groups that are suffering the most from violence that get accused of being violent. And I'm sure the listeners of the Dig have thought about this in domestic settings extensively. But in the case of Palestine, I think we need to repeat it over and over again that this imagery has not been challenged enough in the mainstream. Of course, even when it comes to domestic U.S. issues, we still have a long way to go when it comes to mainstreamizing a more progressive way of thinking around them. But when it comes to Palestine, we're still way behind. And Begin knew that and understood that. He understood that he will get carte blanche if he wants to expand his attacks. And of course, the natural place to do that was Lebanon.
So how did this first major invasion play out in terms of the just kind of mechanics of the Israeli invasion, the various forces on the ground at the time in Lebanon, and then how this phase ended with Israel withdrawing but handing the occupation of southern Lebanon over to Allied forces in an organization called the South Lebanon Army?
So the main Israeli strategy was to look at the south of Lebanon and focus on it, first of all, and essentially examine the sectarian divisions and cleavages existing within it. So their idea was if they could manipulate sectarian divisions, and if they could manipulate social divisions towards creating a hostile environment for Palestinians, and of course their allies in the Lebanese national movement, that would be a great achievement as far as they were concerned. And of course, this meant that they had to find willing collaborators. Now, that was not the most difficult thing to do, because this region had been brutalized by constant Israeli raids. And part of the Israeli strategy was to essentially create a situation where the local population would feel alienated from Fida'i presence, because they every time there was a Fida'i base nearby, or there was a Fida'i operation nearby, it was the civilians that were being punished. So their villages would be attacked and bombed, and in this period, of course, these areas were very poor. So already, there was a delicate situation when it comes to people's living standards, and when you come and bomb further and make people lose their property and whatever little they owned, it's a lot of social pressure. So that's one dimension. And the other element that they were trying to create was to look at areas in which there was any form of sectarian tension. So the south is a very diverse place in Lebanon, like the rest of the country. There are Christian villages, there are Shia villages. The majority are Shia, of course, but there's all sorts of diversity there. And part of the Israeli policy was to try to get the Christian villages or the villagers within them into their sphere of influence, but also to attract as many Shia collaborators as possible through either financial incentivization, providing security support, encouraging different forms of collaboration based on even sometimes gangster methods. So sometimes they'd get like information on a person and they would blackmail them into collaboration. But anyways, out of this, they created like a network. And eventually, the idea was to create what eventually became the South Lebanon Army, which was entirely funded, supported, and armed and trained by the Israeli state. The operation itself in 1978, in terms of the direct operation, the idea was to take over the region up till the Litani River and to create a situation of enormous pressure on Fida'is that were present across the region. So invasion had been expected by Fida'is for quite a while, but this one, was carried out on a large scale. It caused a lot of damage, a lot of bridges were destroyed, a lot of infrastructure was destroyed, heavy fighting took place, and essentially this was the most significant direct engagement between Fida'i forces and the Israeli army since the beginning of Fida'i work. Because, you had, for example, engagement in the Karame battle, but this was much more extensive. This was 7 days of constant engagement. So the effects of this on the Palestinian movement were quite big. There was a feeling that the ranks of the Fida'i ranks had to be bolstered. There was an increasing focus on trying to procure heavy armaments, that sort of thing. And that already there was a trend towards greater formalization of what were before more loose units in the Palestinian arena. That trend was criticized internally because part of the original lure into Fida'i work was guerrilla warfare and the life of the egalitarian life that it had, the lack of ranks, this kind of organization. Now we see increasingly from 1970 onwards, from Black September onwards, a trend where more and more army-style methods are used, and those were relied, the leadership in the PLO relied on actually former Jordanian army officers to be able to do that. So Saad Sayil, who was a former Jordanian army officer, became essentially responsible for trying to create some kind of unified command with ranks, with more formalized ways of fighting that were closer to the classical army style. Of course, this transformation didn't fully take place. There's still guerrilla character of the Fida'i movement still continued, but there was this thing going on, and it was referred to in internal Palestinian discussions as the askara. Also, Palestinians were needing to try to find ways around protecting themselves against any future invasions. And that meant, of course, creating better supply lines in places like Beirut, thinking about different urban centers, how to protect them. And eventually, of course, the invasion did come in 1982.
Around this time, Saddam Hussein's Iraq was in a major conflict with the PLO and was backing something called the Abu Nidal Organization, an Iraqi-affiliated Palestinian faction dedicated above all else to assassinating Palestinian leaders. How in the years since the 1968 Ba'athist coup did Iraq come into this intense conflict with the PLO? And what did that conflict have to do with Iraq's conflict with another party that was constantly intervening in the Palestinian national movement, the Syrian Ba'athists?
So this is an example of the situation in the Palestinian arena. that we've been referring to throughout this series, which is the amount of intervention by Arab states inside this area. Now, of course, the revolutionary Arab states had a special status because a lot of them claimed Palestine as a core part of their ideology. And that was certainly the case for the two Ba'ath states in Iraq and in Syria. In the case of Syria, we've discussed this before. They had an extensive level of engagement. They had the Sa'iqa, which was, of course, a direct arm of the Ba'ath party, but they also had former Ba'athists inside Fatah that they were connected to. They also had, leverage over a wide range of Palestinian movements. And part of this leverage had to do with the fact that Syria borders Palestine, is close by. A lot of Palestinians that fought in the revolution were from refugee camps in Syria. A lot of headquarters of Palestinian organizations were in Syria. So intervention was possible. Of course, the biggest units of the Palestinian Liberation Army, the official army of the PLO, were in Syria. So all of this meant that you had disproportionate influence that could be exerted by that state. And of course, in the Lebanon years of the PLO, Lebanon borders Syria. Syria is the most important country in Lebanon. And so Lebanon is part of its sphere of influence, and it was intervening heavily throughout. On the Iraqi side, Iraq is further away, but ideologically, there's this pronounced commitment to the cause. And of course, you have major interest in this cause throughout. I mean, remember, Iraq is a country that fought in every major war for Palestine, even though it does not have borders. It's, in fact, the only Arab state that doesn't have borders that fought in a serious way in these wars. I mean, of course, Saudi Arabia fought in 48 and so on, but they never sent serious detachments. But Iraq did. So it has a level of involvement that is high in this arena. It has some Palestinian refugee communities, not very big, not nearly as big as Syria or Lebanon or, of course, Jordan, but, there's a small Palestinian refugee population there. There were Palestinian students throughout that were sponsored by the Iraqi government. At any given moment, you'll find thousands of them in Iraq at the time. So there is this involvement, but it's less intense and direct than the Syrian one. However, the Palestinian file is also important for projecting power regionally on the part of any state. So Iraq had to have a role in it in some way. Now, the way they played that role during the Ba'athist period is they had an organization called the Arab Liberation Front, which was fighting as part of the Palestinian Revolution and was, of course, part of the Palestine Liberation Organization. So throughout the 70s, they had also attempted to get Fatah to take a direction that's closer to the Iraqi positions. This was an up and down process. Sometimes they would engage more intensely. Sometimes they would retreat. Sometimes they would host Fatah opposition figures. For example, for a while, the Iraqis hosted people like Naji Alloush and others who were important Palestinian thinkers. They hosted them in Baghdad. They encouraged a split in Fatah around that. And of course, the most prominent figure in that split was this guy called Sabri al-Banna, who is Abu Nidal. He was a character that was disgruntled with Yasser Arafat and with the rest of the Fatah leadership. He found patronage in Baghdad. He had been having tensions with Yasser Arafat since the post-Black September period. There were intense discussions inside Fatah over the performance in that period and over what Palestinians should do after the withdrawal from Jordan. They were accusing increasingly Arafat of selling out by engaging more and more with, the plans around the two-state solution and all of these negotiations in the 70s. So the Iraqis essentially engaged in low-level interventions against Arafat's leadership in the PLO. But it was an up and down relationship. Now, part of their disgruntlement with Arafat also had to do with the fact that he had a big engagement with the Iranians after, in the late 1970s, he had a close relationship with Ayatollah Khomeini, who is, of course, the biggest enemy of the Iraqi state. So it's a complex picture. But Saddam, for example, never breaks relations fully. He just, would use the Abu Nidal connection on the one hand to exert pressure, but at the same time, he still had direct links with Arafat and still engaged with the PLO. It wasn't a situation as clear-cut as, let's say, Assad, where the relationship had just like totally broken down for years, and it was impossible to have a serious connection between the two and between the PLO leadership and the Syrian government, because the Syrian government had a project to establish a parallel leadership.
I want to briefly touch on 1981 when Saudi Arabia's King Fahd made a proposal for Arab-Israeli peace, as it's phrased, with a two-state solution at its core. And it sparked opposition from the PFLP, DFLP, and Assad. How did Fatah respond, and why did this proposal emerge at the time that it did, in the way that it did, in the wake of Camp David, and with the situation in Lebanon continuing to intensify?
So Yasser Arafat was always obsessed with the regional balance of power. That's how he read politics. That's how he conducted politics. So that's already quite different than parties that have clear ideological commitment. In his case, what he was seeing was that Egypt had already done this deal. The Saudis are American allies. Yes, they had a position around Palestine that was quite clear under Faisal, but that was not going to be sustainable under Fahd, who was far less committed to this cause than his predecessors. So the Saudi declaration, while it was read by the Palestinian left, and rightly so, is weakening the Palestinian position when it comes to anything outside the boundaries of 1967. It was seen as useful by those who were trying to angle for a 1967 deal. It essentially was a message for the Americans. Look, here's an incentive for the Israelis to enter into a serious conversation around a Palestinian state. They'll get out of it Saudi recognition and support. They'll get regional integration.
And as much of a capitulation as that proposal may have been, compare that to the deal that Saudi Arabia had been hammering out with the U.S. to normalize and recognize Israel in the months leading up to October 7th.
Yes, I mean it's getting worse and worse, and things. I mean, this is the original American position on this actually, and they've been saying it for a long time, that they need to de-Arabize the policy of Arab states around Palestine. So they were historically committed to pressuring these states to make more and more concessions. So these states start by absolute rejection of the idea of settler colonial state being established. And then, gradually they start saying, okay, we'll accept it within the boundaries that came about as a result of the 48 war. And then now there's this idea that even that doesn't matter. Like, we'll find some ways around this, saying, let's have some Palestinian state emerging, but we don't know what its boundaries are. We don't know what kind of sovereignty it would have. And essentially that's what's going on now. The Saudi Arabia has articulated its current price for this. They want a defense agreement, of course, with the United States now, and they want a peaceful nuclear program. That's a relatively, by the way, cheap price for. This is how ridiculous this got. It wouldn't have been possible under Faisal, for example. King Faisal had a serious commitment when it came to Palestine, and he pursued it. But as we enter into the reign of Fahd, and then we get into now a very different reign under Mohammed bin Salman. We see see things taking that turn, which has great repercussions, because Saudi Arabia is not a minor regional player. It is the biggest Arab state since Egypt exited the realm of serious Arab politics under Sadat. Since Nasser's death, Saudi Arabia progressively became the strongest and most influential state in the region. So it's a big issue for the Palestinian people. One of the ironies in this, Daniel, is the current king, the father of the crown prince who was making this policy, for the longest time was the head of the Solidarity Committee with the Palestinians in Riyadh. And it's true. For many years, Salman bin Abdel Aziz was the chairman of that committee. He was seen as a very Palestine-friendly person in Saudi Arabia. But his son currently takes a very different stance. Why are we focusing on individuals, by the way, when we talk about Saudi Arabia? Because it matters.
In a monarchy, it matters big time.
Yes, because all the power is concentrated. I mean, that's part of the critique, of course, radical critique of monarchical, absolutist monarchical rule. The actual dispositions of the monarch matter, like their personality matters, unfortunately, because they could wake up one day and be like, okay, I don't like this Palestinian thing. It's constraining me too much. Now, of course, structural factors do matter as well, but, the state will adjust its policy according to the whim of the monarch. And we've seen that. I would argue, actually, that the Saudi foreign policy establishment, took a very different position than MBS historically. But he signals, basically, now we're changing direction. They have to change direction. Same with Abu Dhabi. Under Sheikh Zayed, there was not a commitment towards major engagement with the Israeli settler colonial state, partly because, what's the reason? I mean, they're not even bordering that state. It's not, the Emirates is a rich place. I mean, there are financial benefits from having a relationship now, and that's what they focus on when they promote this peace agreement that they've arrived at with the Israelis. But in reality, it's a very wealthy country. It already has enormous resources. The pressure on it, was not the main reason why it took this move.
And the last thing I want to do is compliment Sadat, but there's more of a straightforward logic to what Egypt was getting in exchange for Camp David, which was the Sinai back.
Yes, of course. Now, I should note what the Emirates now got out of the Abraham Accords was actually getting a direct line to Washington that away from Saudi Arabia. So this is, and that's a conversation that is more about contemporary affairs and history. But honestly, if you connect it to the history of the region, you'll see that the main strategic fear for all the smaller Gulf states along the coast was from Saudi Arabia and, of course, Iran and Iraq historically. Now, in contemporary times, after, of course, the Gulf War, Iraq is out of the equation, and definitely after the invasion and occupation of Iraq. So it's Iran and Saudi Arabia that are the two big countries that the smaller Gulf states need to grapple with. Saudi Arabia was trying, since the independence of these states, to incorporate them within its sphere of influence. And in many ways, it succeeded initially. With varying degrees, of course. However, there has been a trend to challenge that and to assert greater independence. And the best way to do that is to establish a direct relationship with Washington, and the pathway has been this Israeli pathway.
In 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon on a mission to destroy the PLO, linking up with right-wing Maronite Phalangist militia allies to lay siege to West Beirut. The assault was absolutely brutal on civilians who were besieged, cut off from food and water. Even so, the PLO and allied Lebanese left-wing forces, alongside Syrians who finally switched back to the side of the PLO and the Lebanese left, they held out with remarkable strength. But given the incredible death toll that Israel and the Phalangists imposed on civilians, the PLO ultimately agreed to withdraw its forces from Beirut with strict guarantees provided by the U.S. that Palestinian civilians would be protected. That, of course, is not what happened. Some very horrific massacres took place. But before we get to that, what prompted the Israeli invasion and then the siege of West Beirut?
Again, I think that invasion has to be read in terms of the overall Israeli strategy, which was they wanted the PLO out, and that we already talked about how Begin was pursuing that. He was waiting for a moment that would be opportune to do this, and with the region suffering from the effects of Camp David, we see him entering into a situation where increasingly something like an actual invasion of Lebanon would be possible. So what took place was not possible if the Americans had said no. What took place was not possible had the Soviet Union taken a stronger stance. And this is another interesting situation that we were witnessing now. None of the major global powers were willing to stop this. Of course, the Americans gave a green light for it. Not only they were not willing to stop it. And people will tell you, well, this American president or that American president didn't want things to go that far. Reagan was surprised, or now Biden doesn't like it, but it's not a convincing argument. They're the ones that are protecting these actions. The least they could do is get a Security Council decision saying this is major aggression immediately. There could have been, like now in Gaza. Look at the situation now. So similarly, what we were having in 1982 was a major American complicity, of course, in all what was going on and the crimes that were committed against civilians. And these were huge crimes. There was a commission, the McBride Commission, that documented many of these crimes. I would encourage our listeners to check out the commission report. It was never widely advertised or popularized, unfortunately, but it contains a lot of useful information from that time. And you had up to 20,000 people getting killed. You had the use of these awful cluster bombs, the destruction of a huge amount of Beirut's buildings. Of course, it all started with a plan that used to be called the accordion plan. That's how it was referred to at the time, which was to try to essentially create a situation where the Palestinians would be in the middle and then they're crushed from two sides. That's why it was referred to as the accordion. There were multiple sites of attack that were happening simultaneously. The invasion utilized a huge amount of forces, Israeli forces, and major air power was used, major bombardment was used. The Palestinian situation, initially, there was a collapse in the south, and there was a quick withdrawal from the south as well. And I mention this now because that led to huge repercussions internally within the Palestinian movement after the war ended, after the withdrawal from Beirut, because there were demands for holding those accountable that were responsible for this collapse in the south and for the quick withdrawal. But the military performance improved significantly after Palestinian forces concentrated in Beirut, and they were able basically to defend it for 2 months. There was no military collapse, actually. In many ways, the basic services continued to be there. The supplies were there. As I mentioned, there was good preparation before 1982 on that front. The Women's Union played a big role, by the way, when it came to the coordination of things like bread, the bakeries, the distribution of bread and water and basic necessities. A lot of the things that go into defending a city, we don't think about them, but they have to do with sustaining life. And essentially, life was still sustainable even under that siege. The horrific siege, the brutal siege, and even under all the destruction that was going on, which was unprecedented, by the way, until Gaza now happened. Like, this is, the Gaza genocide takes things to the next level, but that was, Beirut was a vicious Israeli attack, honestly.
Before we get to the end of this story and the ultimate PLO evacuation, who was allied with whom on what side? If you could just sort of lay that out.
So we continued to have the same situation that had prevailed during the Lebanese Civil War, of course. The same alliance it was still at play. You had the Lebanese National Movement on the one hand, along with its ally, the PLO. And then you had the sectarian Maronite forces, and they were allied with the Israeli state, of course. So those were two major players. The Syrians, of course, were playing a role with the PLO and the Lebanese National Movement. Although, by the way, most of their focus was on defending the Damascus-Beirut road. So they did not do full military deployment there. And this is quite important, partly because they had a major Air Force failure. The Israelis were able to destroy many Syrian fighter jets. And that was an important, by the way, event in the Cold War, because it showed the superiority of American Air Force technology at this stage over the Soviet fighter jets that were used by the Syrian military. Their radar systems were not as developed. There were many major flaws. So the Arab states did not intervene in any serious military way. And this was very significant because you had essentially an Arab capital being invaded and there was no action. This would have been unthinkable under Nasser, let's say. In 1967, he had mobilized his troops, withdrew the UN troops from Sinai over information given by the Soviets and others that Israelis were mobilizing on the border with Syria. So, even a mobilization on the border with Syria caused something like that. Now we have a situation where the Israeli state is invading an Arab country, besieging an Arab capital, and there was no serious action. So that tells you a lot about this post-Camp David atmosphere. Similarly, on the Saudi front, there was no major intervention that would, seriously get the Americans to stop this war. It was just like total. It exemplified the collapse of a joint Arab security formula in the post-Nasser period.
How did the war end with the evacuation of thousands of armed PLO Fedayeen in the presence of a multinational military force? And what sort of moment did this mark in the Lebanese Civil War and, of course, for the Palestinian Revolution?
The difficulty for the PLO throughout in its presence in Lebanon was that it was not operating on Palestinian territory. It was in Lebanon, which is a country that is, of course, culturally and socially and ethnically close to Palestine, but it was not Palestine. And there were natural allies for the PLO within Lebanese society. By the way, at least as many people were killed from the south as there were Palestinians fighting in Palestinian Fidai ranks, within Palestinian Fidai ranks. So there was a huge amount of love and support and commitment for the Palestinian cause in Lebanese society, and as much as there was a hatred for it from some sections that were driven by isolationist ideology, you had enormous support for the cause from other sections of the population, and definitely the entirety of the Lebanese left. For them, Palestine was a major priority throughout, but there were limits to what you could do in a situation like this. Arafat could have decided to stay in Beirut, but it would have been a Stalingrad option, and it would have meant the destruction of the whole city. And the scenario was getting close to that as the weeks went on, and there was no Arab action, there was no international action to stop the Israelis. So it was kind of like the genocide now. All these people were like, stop it, stop it, stop it. But like, nobody knows what to do to make the Americans and everybody else like intervene, or to stop actually supporting the invasion. So he was under enormous pressure from within Lebanese society to leave. And it got to a stage where actually his own Lebanese allies were telling him, Abu Ammar, you need to leave now. So there are recollections by George Howie, for example, the Lebanese communists and leader and others, Mohsen Ibrahim and others, all of these major Lebanese leftist leaders were like, Abu Ammar, Yasser Arafat, look, you guys have to leave now. Like, otherwise the whole country will be destroyed. So I think he could have said no, but he decided that this was the only thing he could do at this stage, the best thing he could do at this stage. He also thought that he might be able to come back, by the way. And that's part of the story, because he did try to make a comeback. And he was, of course, stopped by the Syrians when he did try to make his comeback. But anyways, now the main question for Arafat when it came to leaving was, how to do it in a manner that would not lead to major massacres against Palestinian civilians that would be left. And secondly, how to do it in a manner that would retain the power of the PLO regionally and would minimize its losses out of leaving such an important space as Lebanon. And he basically had to reach a deal with the Americans. The Americans had an envoy, Philip Habib, who was sent to broker essentially a PLO departure. At the end of the day, there were guarantees given to the PLO that if it departs, the Palestinian civilians that would be left would be protected and would not be attacked. There were also international guarantees over the fighters, leaving with their weapons, going somewhere else, without being attacked. So there was a formula that was arrived at to achieve this. And that became a big problem in the internal Palestinian arena, of course. One important piece of the equation when we're talking about the pressures, besides the local Lebanese pressures on Arafat, the other element that's important to remember is that he was worried about also all sorts of international pressures. He was worried that there would be a scenario where eventually the Israeli state would be given a green light to continue operating until not only it destroys the country, but it destroys the PLO as a whole. There might be even other forces that might come to its aid. There were all sorts of rumors about all sorts of Western forces intervening. The French were pressuring, the Americans were pressuring, and as I mentioned earlier, the Soviets were doing nothing. So, like the situation in Gaza today, by the way, that was a moment that created, however, major solidarity with the Palestinian cause. And it was in many ways pretty much the first time that you had a huge wave of solidarity movements developing in Europe on a big scale around Palestine. So there was a great deal of awareness built around Beirut because of the level of destruction and the horrors that were unleashed on the population. Unfortunately, that solidarity came at a very high price, and it was too small to be able to change events. In the United States, it did not develop in a big way, probably because the coverage at the time was so controlled. So the U.S. was one of the places where it did not spread as much as it should have. But definitely in Western Europe, you had big movements developing, and of course, in other parts of the world that were sympathetic, you had a lot of solidarity around 82.
As we've mentioned, the PLO evacuation was only agreed to on the condition that Palestinian civilians would be protected. But instead, IDF flares illuminated the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps, while Israel's right-wing phalangist allies carried out horrific massacres. How did these massacres take place? And then what were the consequences for this for the United States, for Israel, for Lebanon, for so many Arab states that did nothing as Israel violently expelled the Palestinian Revolution from Beirut, and above all else, for the PLO, which had now evacuated as these massacres were taking place? What sort of moment did this mark in the Lebanese civil war and for the Palestinian Revolution?
So the Palestinian forces left Beirut, as we know, in 1982. Yasser Arafat, of course, boarded a Greek ship, ended up being received by Papandreou, the Greek prime minister at the time, and essentially the leadership of the movement and most of its fighters had exited the scene. In the meantime, what the Israelis did was to go around every major area and take thousands of prisoners. They essentially imprisoned most of the men, the young men of fighting age, and they put them in a major concentration camp called Ansar. And then essentially that left a lot of the women and the elderly and the children in the Palestinian refugee camps without any protection, because the armed fighters had been taken out already with the withdrawal. The remaining young men were in these concentration camps, horrible concentration camps, by the way. And in the meantime, Ariel Sharon, who was really one of the masterminds behind the whole of the 82 invasion episode, but was also an extremist Zionist visionary in many ways, because he had a vision for elimination of Palestinians that goes back decades. I mean, he's done massacres for a long time, and in the 50s he did massacres, and in 82 he designed Sabra and Shatila massacre, actually. And of course, the people that implemented the massacre were Israel's clients, the phalangists and their allied forces. But it was done, as you mentioned, through the Israeli forces encircling the camp, lighting it up, coordinating the logistics around it, and really authorizing the whole operation. So it was an Israeli massacre done through the phalangist tool. The massacre was horrific. I mean, you just had these killers essentially entering and just wreaking havoc and taking the lives of just women and children and elderly people, and even animals in the refugee camp. They destroyed everything they could destroy. They killed everyone they could kill. And it was this was not their first time of doing that. And Tel Zatar, of course, they did it, and they've been doing it for a long time. It's systematic, but Sabra and Shatila just took it to a very, very horrible level. There's, of course, an important book on this that was documenting the massacre that was produced by the great Palestinian historian Bayan Wahid al-Hout. We mentioned her before in this series, but she wrote a very important book for those listeners that want to check it out. In any case, with Sabra and Shatila, there was no guarantee for Palestinian safety or security in the post-PLO withdrawal period in Lebanon. I should note that Palestinian divisions within the PLO increased, and within Fatah itself increased in this period, partly because of the way the withdrawal happened. Many people did not want to withdraw. They thought that Arafat took a singular decision without consultation or enough consultation and without transparency around it. They were against the withdrawal from the south and the way it happened, the disorderly withdrawal from the Lebanese south at the beginning of the war. And essentially, the Syrian state was behind crystallizing their demands into an active movement within Fatah. So Assad essentially sponsored around these legitimate critiques, the critique of the disorderly withdrawal from the south and the leadership. They created a situation where essentially they would split the movement, and they encouraged the Fatah left to make a move against Yasser Arafat within the movement. So you had figures associated with that left, Abu Saleh, and then, of course, with them there were military figures that were not necessarily ideologically left-wing, but that had critiques over the military performance, mainly Abu Musa, who used to be an officer in the Jordanian army, but then joined the PLO, and then Abu Khalid al-Amli, another officer. These figures were joined by ideological leaders in the PLO. The head of the Jordan Bureau was very important, Qadri, and a major intellectual, and their main theorist was a major intellectual who used to be a professor actually in the US before leaving and joining the revolution in the 70s. So you had Ilyas Shufani, who was a professor in the US and then left. He became the theorist and then left and joined the revolution. He became the theorist of the split in many ways. So it was a big and major consequence that happened at the time, and we can talk about it more extensively later.
What did this mean in terms of the strength of the Soviet Union and the status of its foreign policy, specifically its orientation toward revolutionary projects around the world and willingness and or ability to actively support those projects? Because at this point, they had invaded Afghanistan. They were also deeply involved alongside Cuba in fighting colonialism and apartheid in Southern Africa and Angola and Namibia. Why weren't they willing or able to protect the PLO?
This has to do with general decline in the Soviet position globally under Brezhnev. Actually, essentially, Brezhnev was the leader in 1982. It was his last days. The period under Brezhnev, towards the end of his rule, saw a lack of action. He died, by the way, in November 82. So already he was in a declining position. The Soviet Union was already committed in Afghanistan at the stage, and it was getting embroiled in a deep military situation there. It was its own Vietnam in many ways. So many people believe that, for example, had Andropov been in the Soviet leadership at the time, they might have taken a more decisive position. I don't know if that's the case, but possibly, because in his brief tenure, which did not last long, basically he just lasted for a year, Andropov did engage with the region more extensively. But obviously, in the last days of Brezhnev, there was no serious action taken. And that was a huge hit for the Soviet prestige in the region. It caused major problems for the Soviet Union. And I think that in many ways it illustrated to the whole world that when it came to what is the most sensitive file on the global regional agenda, which is the actual question of Palestine file at this stage, because it has to do so much with the entirety of the Middle East region. The Soviets were basically out. The Americans now were, as Sadat mentioned or predicted years earlier, they were holding the cards.
In our epilogue, we'll cover in a more general sense what came next from the 1980s through the present for the Palestinian national movement, for Lebanon, for the entirety of the Arab East. But this does seem like the place to end the story that we've been telling in Thawra. In 1983, Fatah co-founder Khaled al-Hassan said, quote, "We have to say that the Arabs as a united power does not exist, and therefore the Americans are at ease. Their interests are not touched." And so it seems fair to say that the Arab nationalist and left-wing anti-imperialist project was always correct. It was indeed Arab unity that was key to defeating colonizers and imperialists. Because meanwhile, the colonizers and imperialists were dedicated to sowing Arab disunity. And what we see by 1982 very clearly is that they have succeeded. Is 1982, where we're finishing this episode, is this the moment when it became clear that reaction had, for the time being, triumphed, marking the end of this era of Arab revolutionary politics that we've spent so many hours discussing?
I mean, I'm always hesitant when it comes to answering questions on when is the moment of dusk and when do things end, when do things unravel. But definitely 1982 was a huge blow to the whole region and to the Palestinian cause and to other causes associated with progressive agendas in the region. There was American paramountcy increasingly growing. It witnessed a situation where it seemed that most progressive forces were on the retreat. But is it the moment when all of this happens? No, this was part of a cumulative process that we've referred to aspects of it before. And there were always moments of potential regeneration. Unfortunately, however, by 82, the regional map was no longer favorable for revolutionary action. The main revolutionary states were now essentially taken over by bureaucratized and militarized organs of the state. Some of these states were under the whims of basically rulers that were very random in their approach. For example, Libya. And Muammar Gaddafi's position in 82 was actually representative of this trend. He said that Palestinians should stay and die in Lebanon. And that's the honorable thing to do, which of course was rejected by them. The Iraqi government did not intervene in any major or serious way to stop what was going on. Of course, it was more focused on its war with Iran, which we'll talk about later. The Syrian government became focused now on ensuring that it gets out of the 82 withdrawal and defeat a greater amount of influence within the PLO by creating the split within Fatah. So they were just angling basically for an enhancement of their position. In the meantime, the Arab states that were not revolutionary were just seeing how they could engage with the Americans more in this phase. The Saudis, were limiting their engagement. within acceptable US parameters. The Jordanians were doing the same, the Egyptians were doing the same, and that meant that all of the revolutionary dreams of the past had taken a huge hit. People were stuck between two types of states, one that was no longer, one type that was no longer focusing on providing an emancipatory horizon. And in many ways, when it came to personal freedoms and political freedoms, they were actually creating stark realities on the ground. And on the other hand, you had the monarchical regimes stabilizing and essentially engaging with the American agenda more and more. Internally, these regimes are going also through a new set of challenges. So, and we'll talk about these challenges later. But these challenges had no longer had to do with the left. They had to do with the religious right, and they had to do with forces that they had mobilized against the left in the past, but that were now mobilizing against them. So, for example, Saudi Arabia had a huge challenge in the aftermath of the Iranian Revolution, and we'll talk about it again later. When the holy sites were actually taken over by a radical religious group that they had to deal with, and those are the kind of internal threats that they were dealing with now. It was no longer the leftist movements that they had suppressed and whose members they had imprisoned in the past that were becoming their major threat. The major threat was coming from elsewhere.
That was the 16th and final episode of Thawra, the Dig series on 20th century Arab politics with Abdel Razzaq Takriti, who teaches history at Rice University. Stay tuned for one last installment. It's a substantial epilogue. Abed is a scholar of Arab and Palestinian revolutionary movements. He's the author of Monsoon Revolution, Republicans, Sultans, and Empires in Oman, and the co-author of the Palestinian Revolution Digital Humanities website, an incredible resource that's now back online. Click the link in the show notes. Thank you for listening to The Dig from Jacobin Magazine. As Marx once said, after noting that revolutions are the locomotives of history, while other podcasts have only interpreted the world in various ways, our point is to change it. We're posting new episodes most weeks. The Dig was produced by Alex Lewis. Our associate producer is Jackson Roach. Music by Jeffrey Brodsky. Our communications coordinator is Sylvia Atwood. Our senior advisors are Theorio Francos and Ben Mabey. Check out our vast archives and newsletters at thedigradio.com. Follow us on Twitter and also now Instagram at thedigradio. And find us wherever you get podcasts and subscribe to this podcast. If it's on iTunes or Spotify or wherever, please also rate and review us. Those reviews really do help introduce us to new listeners. But even better than that is you telling people in real life, on the internet, wherever, that you love The Dig and that they might too. Please make propaganda for us. And do find us at patreon.com and make a monthly or annual contribution to keep this operation up and running strong. Even a few bucks is huge.